One of my favorite parts of RPGs is when I've beaten some significant quest or boss battle, and I finally get to see what kind of cool treasure I've earned. I love getting cool looking new armor, more powerful weapons, all that good stuff. But one thing that I'm usually not very excited to find is money. Which is kinda weird, right? Finding ludicrous amounts of money should be awesome. Think of all the stuff you could do with $1 million. I do, all the time. I'd pay off my student loans and buy my own house. I'd get a nicer computer and a better mic, and maybe even put a recording studio in my new house. The possibilities are endless. And that's the difference between money in real life and money in RPGs. There are a very limited number of ways to spend money you find in a game. And eventually you'll reach a point where you've already gotten everything there is to spend money on. After that, any extra money you find is basically worthless. And D&D is certainly not an exception to that. Looking at the equipment section of the player's handbook, there are a lot of things you could spend money on, but not a lot that you would spend it on. You could buy any of these weapons listed here, but most classes that care about weapons start with the weapon they want. You could buy a phial of Alchemist's Fire, but it turns out Alchemist's Fire does as much damage per turn as getting bit by a deer. And you could buy an elephant for half the price of a breastplate, but you'd probably have to leave it outside when you go into literally any city, dungeon, or building, which is usually a very significant amount of time in most campaigns. So how do we fix this? How do we make finding treasure as exciting for your players as it should be for their characters? I've seen people use a couple of different methods. Most of them have merit, but all of them have some drawbacks. One way that DMs try to get around this is by just giving less treasure. That does make finding treasure feel cooler, since you don't get it as often, but you can definitely go too far in the other direction. Players like getting treasure. For a lot of players, myself included, it's one of the main draws of the game. In fact, the most common complaint I've heard from players about their previous DMs was not getting enough treasure. So there's a balance to be struck here. I found a sweet spot that I find works for my games. My rule of thumb is that between one level up and another, each player should make gold roughly equal to their current level times 100. So a level 2 character in my games could expect to make about 200 gold pieces before they reach level 3. This is obviously an important thing to consider, but being careful with how much money you give isn't solving my biggest complaint with money, which is that there aren't enough uses for it. All we've done is delay how quickly players will reach that point where money becomes worthless. So the other obvious solution is to give players more ways to spend their gold. One thing that players can spend their money on is what I call taxes. Taxes are basically any expense that players have to spend their money on. Stuff like buying rations, paying for inns, and actual literal taxes. It adds a touch of realism to your game, which I like, but in terms of game mechanics, this isn't much different than just awarding less gold. Except that it's more bookkeeping for your players, which tends to get old fast, so don't go crazy with this one. Letting players buy magic items is a more interesting way to give players a money outlet. Players will certainly be more excited by this, but it does have some downsides. One is that it makes going out and finding magic items less special. Personally, I'm of the belief that a character's magic items should be like a record of the epic struggle that they overcame and the foes that they vanquished to find it. Going down to the corner store and buying a ring of power doesn't have the same weight as traveling across Middle-earth, infiltrating a massive goblin den, and defeating a weird little guy in a battle of wits. The second downside is that the rules don't account for buying magic items. There's some very vague guidelines on prices by item rarity, but items of the same rarity vary wildly in power level, so that really isn't much to go off of. Also, if you let players choose their own items instead of curating them, there is a much greater chance they will break your game. I've learned that one the hard way when I was new to the game. Now, I do actually allow players to buy magic items from shops, but shops in my world only have common items and a curated selection of uncommon items. By the time they can afford those items, they will have found much more powerful items that will serve as their iconic character-defining items. Their lightsabers and their Mjolnir and their Kalendor and their Black Razor. That way the players get to spend their money on cool stuff, but they still have to struggle for really game-changing items. And finally, we get to one that I haven't seen anyone use or suggest before. Give every character in your party some kind of goal related to their backstory or motivation. It can be the reason your character got into adventuring in the first place, or it can just be some secondary motivation. It's gotta be something that can be solved with gold, though. That's important. Here's a few examples that your players could use as their goals. You're in debt to dangerous people and need to pay them off. You're saving up for a diamond to resurrect a lost loved one. You're sending money home to your parents to pay off their farm after a particularly bad harvest. One of my players currently is donating money to restore a local run-down orphanage that took him in when he was a young street urchin. Your players should work with you to come up with these, by the way. This isn't just a money sink, like taxes, though. The goal is not to just take money away from the players to make it more scarce. Because if they wanted to, any player could just donate their gold to something, to whatever they wanted. It's D&D, you can do pretty much anything. But I want this to contribute to the core concept of the game. Once a player has reached a goal, for my table it's 500 gold pieces per player, they get a feat. And I do this instead of what I used to do, which is giving everyone a free feat at level 1. They still get that extra character customization that 5e sorely lacks, but now they have to earn it. It feeds into their character motivations and backstories, so the players don't just feel like they're buying a feat, even though that is technically what's happening when you get down to it. And it doesn't have to be a one-time thing either. As your story progresses, players will usually find new goals they want to pursue, and you could do it again if you saw fit. Maybe the second goal they pursue requires 2,000 gold instead of 500, and if you do a third, maybe that one costs 8,000. You don't have to use those exact numbers, of course. Do what works for your table. But it gives players more choices, it gives them a way to spend money that isn't just buying armor and spell scrolls, and it makes gold that much more valuable. That's all I've got on treasure today, but what about you guys? Is there anything I missed? What do you do to make gold more interesting? Comment down below so I can steal it from my table. As always, thanks for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. All that good stuff. Goodbye.
Mwah.